What would you do if the land that raised you was taken, your ancestors erased from memory, and the only way to prove your worth was to fight in a war that was never yours? What if the battlefield was not the desert canyons of your homeland, but the frozen, blood-soaked trenches of a distant continent, where death whispered in languages you had never heard? Before you continue, I want you to do something. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. And if this story moves you, if it makes you feel something, please subscribe. This channel needs your help to keep bringing you these forgotten stories that history tried to bury. In the autumn of 1917, somewhere in the muddy hellscape of northeastern France, German soldiers began reporting something that their commanders refused to believe. Sentries were vanishing from their posts without a sound. Not killed by artillery, not cut down by machine gun fire, but simply gone. Their bodies would be found days later, sometimes weeks, in places that made no tactical sense, deep behind Allied lines, hanging from trees in forests that no patrol had entered, floating face down in rivers that ran red with something other than mud. The reports spoke of a shadow that moved through no man's land, as if the barbed wire and the craters and the poison gas were nothing more than obstacles in a hunting ground. They spoke of a figure who painted his face with the ash of the dead, and carried a blade that gleamed like moonlight on water. They called him Der Geist, the ghost. They called him Der Teufel der Schützengräben, the devil of the trenches. But the American soldiers who fought alongside him knew his real name. They called him Joseph Greywolf, and he was the last of the Apache scouts. The story of Joseph Greywolf begins not in France, but in the scorched red earth of the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona Territory, in the year 1891. He was born during a thunderstorm so violent that the elders said the sky itself was at war. His mother, a woman named Itza Chu, which meant great hawk in the tongue of the Chiricahua, died bringing him into the world. His father, a man who had once ridden with Geronimo in the final desperate years of Apache resistance, raised the boy alone in a wooden shack that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had deemed sufficient for their kind. From the moment Joseph could walk, his father taught him the old ways. Not the sanitized versions that the reservation schools tried to force upon Apache children, but the true ways. The ways of the hunt, the ways of the shadow, the ways of war. By the age of 7, Joseph could track a rabbit across bare rock. By 10, he could move through a forest without disturbing a single leaf. By 14, he had killed his first mountain lion with nothing but a knife his father had forged from the blade of a cavalry saber, a blade that had once belonged to the soldiers who had driven their people onto the reservation. The reservation was a prison without walls. The Apache, once the most feared warriors in the American Southwest, had been reduced to farmers on land that could barely grow weeds. The children were sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language, forbidden to practice their ceremonies, forbidden to be anything other than what the government wanted them to be. Joseph attended one of these schools for 3 years. He learned English. He learned mathematics. He learned the history of a nation that had tried to exterminate his people. And every night, when the lights went out in the dormitory, he would slip out through a window that the supervisors never thought to check and practice the skills his father had taught him in the darkness of the Arizona desert. In 1906, Joseph's father died. The official cause was tuberculosis, a disease that swept through the reservations like wildfire, fed by malnutrition and despair. But Joseph knew the truth. His father had died of a broken heart. He had watched everything he loved, everything he had fought for, everything that made him Apache, stripped away piece by piece until there was nothing left but a hollow shell waiting for death to claim it. Joseph was 15 years old when he buried his father in a secret place in the mountains, a place the government did not know about, a place where the old ceremonies could still be performed. He sang the death songs that his father had taught him. He painted his face with the sacred colors, and he made a vow. He would carry the spirit of his people with him wherever he went. He would prove that the Apache were not a defeated race, not a broken people waiting to fade into history. He would show the world that the blood of warriors still ran in their veins. For the next 11 years, Joseph drifted. He worked as a ranch hand in Texas, as a railroad laborer in New Mexico, as a hunting guide in Colorado. He took whatever jobs would have him, saved what money he could, and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, but he knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that his moment would come. That moment arrived on April 6, 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany. Within weeks, recruitment offices across the nation were flooded with young men eager to fight. Posters appeared on every street corner, depicting Uncle Sam pointing his finger at passers-by, demanding that they do their patriotic duty. The newspapers were filled with stories of German atrocities, of innocent civilians slaughtered, of ancient cities reduced to rubble. The war to end all wars, they called it. The war to make the world safe for democracy. Joseph read those newspapers. He saw those posters, and he felt something stir inside him that he had not felt since his father's death. Here was a chance to prove himself. Here was a battlefield where his skills would matter. Here was an opportunity to show the world what an Apache warrior could do. He walked into the recruitment office in Albuquerque on a morning in May when the desert heat was already baking the sidewalks. The sergeant behind the desk looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Joseph was 26 years old, lean as a coyote, with black hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that seemed to see things that other men could not. "What are you?" the sergeant asked. "Mexican?" Joseph shook his head. "Apache," he said. The sergeant laughed. "We do not take Indians," he said. "Go back to your reservation." Joseph did not move. He stood there, staring at the sergeant with those unnerving eyes, until the man's laughter died in his throat. "You will take me," Joseph said, "and you will be glad you did." There is no record of what happened next in that recruitment office. The official documents show only that Joseph Graywolf, occupation listed as laborer, residence listed as San Carlos, Arizona, was accepted into the United States Army on May 19, 1917. He was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division and shipped to Camp Dix in New Jersey for basic training. The training camps were a revelation. Joseph had spent his entire life learning to move silently, to strike from the shadows, to kill with precision and efficiency. The Army, it seemed, wanted something entirely different. They wanted men who could march in straight lines, who could fire their rifles in unison, who could charge across open ground into the teeth of machine gun fire without flinching. They wanted men who could die obediently. Joseph played along. He marched when they told him to march. He shot when they told him to shoot. He followed orders with such mechanical precision that his drill instructors began to suspect he was mocking them. But at night, when the other recruits were sleeping off their exhaustion, Joseph would slip out of the barracks and disappear into the forests that surrounded the camp. He would hunt. He would track. He would practice the old ways, keeping his skills sharp for the battlefield that awaited him. It was during one of these nocturnal excursions that Joseph first came to the attention of Captain Marcus Whitfield of the Army Intelligence Division. Whitfield was a Yale-educated officer from a wealthy Connecticut family, a man who had studied military history the way other men studied scripture. He had read accounts of the Apache Wars, of the decades-long struggle between the United States cavalry and the warriors of the Southwest. He knew that the Apache had never been truly defeated in battle, that they had surrendered only because their families were starving, their children dying, their way of life systematically destroyed by forces beyond their control. Whitfield found Joseph in a clearing 3 miles from the camp, moving through a series of exercises that looked like a cross between combat training and religious ritual. The captain watched from the shadows for nearly an hour, transfixed by what he was seeing. When Joseph finally stopped, Whitfield stepped forward and introduced himself. "I have been reading about your people," Whitfield said. "The Apache scouts, the warriors who could track a man across 100 miles of desert, the fighters who terrified the entire southwestern frontier for 30 years. Joseph said nothing. He simply watched the captain with those dark, unreadable eyes. "The war in Europe," Whitfield continued, "is not like anything we have ever seen. The trenches stretch from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Millions of men facing each other across a few hundred yards of mud and wire. Neither side can advance. Neither side can retreat. It is a stalemate, and it is killing a generation." Joseph still did not speak. "But there are missions," Whitfield said, lowering his voice. "Missions that require a different kind of soldier. Reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Silent elimination of key targets. Work that cannot be done by men who only know how to march and shoot. Work that requires the skills you have been practicing out here every night." That was how Joseph Graywolf became a member of the newly formed Special Operations Group, a unit so secret that its existence would not be acknowledged by the War Department for another 70 years. The group consisted of 12 men, handpicked by Captain Whitfield from across the American Expeditionary Forces. There were sharpshooters from the mountains of Tennessee, trappers from the forests of Minnesota, hunters from the swamps of Louisiana, men who knew how to survive in the wilderness, how to move without being seen, how to kill without making a sound. But even among these exceptional individuals, Joseph stood apart. During the group's training exercises in the English countryside, he demonstrated abilities that defied explanation. He could cross a field of dry leaves without producing a whisper of sound. He could remain motionless for hours, invisible even to observers who knew exactly where to look. He could sense the presence of other humans from distances that seemed impossible, as if he possessed some sixth sense that civilization had bred out of the rest of them. The other members of the group were wary of him at first. They had grown up hearing stories about the savage Indians of the frontier, about scalping and torture and rituals too horrible to describe. But as the weeks of training passed, their wariness turned to respect, and their respect turned to something close to awe. Joseph never boasted. He never complained. He simply did what needed to be done, with a quiet efficiency that made the rest of them feel like clumsy amateurs. It was Private Thomas Birdsong, a Choctaw from Oklahoma, who had also been recruited for the unit, who first got Joseph to open up about his past. The two Native Americans formed a bond that transcended the rivalry between their peoples, a bond forged in the shared experience of being outsiders in a white man's army, fighting a white man's war. "My father used to tell me stories," Joseph said one night, as the two men sat cleaning their weapons in the dim light of a barn that served as their barracks. Stories about the old days, before the reservations. He said that an Apache warrior was not just a fighter. He was a guardian, a protector. He fought not because he loved killing, but because he loved his people. Every enemy he defeated was a threat removed. Every battle he won was another day of safety for his family. Thomas nodded. "My grandfather said something similar," he replied. "He said that a true warrior fights for life, not for death, that the greatest victory is the one where no blood is spilled at all." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not know if I believe that anymore. I have seen what the white man does to those who will not fight. I have seen my people broken and scattered like leaves in the wind. Sometimes I think that the only language this world understands is violence. The only argument it respects is force." In September of 1917, the Special Operations Group was deployed to France. They crossed the Atlantic on a troop ship called the USS Henderson, packed into the hold with 2,000 other soldiers, breathing air that smelled of sweat and fear, and the diesel fumes that seeped down from the engines. Joseph spent most of the voyage on deck, staring out at the gray expanse of the ocean, watching for the German submarines that stalked these waters like wolves hunting a wounded elk. The ship docked at the port of Saint-Nazaire on a morning when the rain fell so heavily that it seemed the sky itself was weeping. The soldiers disembarked into a world that looked like something from a nightmare. The streets were filled with ambulances carrying the wounded, with trucks hauling ammunition and supplies, with columns of men marching toward a front line that consumed them like a furnace consuming coal. Captain Whitfield gathered his unit in a warehouse near the docks and briefed them on their first mission. German intelligence had established a listening post in a ruined village about 15 miles behind the front lines. The post was intercepting Allied communications, feeding information to German artillery that was decimating the trenches. Conventional forces had tried to assault the position twice. Both attempts had ended in disaster. Now it was the Special Operations Group's turn. The unit set out that night, moving through a landscape that had been transformed by 3 years of industrialized warfare. The forests had been reduced to fields of shattered stumps. The villages were nothing but piles of rubble. The roads were rivers of mud churned by the passage of countless men and machines. And everywhere, there was the smell of cordite and rotting flesh, of poison gas and burning wood, of death in all its forms. Joseph led the way. He moved through the darkness with a surety that bordered on the supernatural, navigating by instincts that his ancestors had honed over countless generations. The other members of the unit followed in his footsteps, literally placing their feet where his had been, trusting him to guide them through the maze of craters and wire and unexploded shells. They reached the outskirts of the ruined village just before dawn. Joseph signaled for the unit to halt and disappeared into the shadows to reconnoiter. He was gone for 3 hours. When he returned, he had a complete map of the German position sketched in the mud, showing the location of every sentry, every machine gun nest, every communication trench. The assault began at midnight. Joseph went in first, alone, while the rest of the unit provided covering positions. He moved through the German defenses like smoke through a keyhole, silent and insubstantial. The first sentry died without ever knowing he was in danger. The second managed to turn his head toward the sound of his comrade falling. But by then, Joseph's blade was already at his throat. In 23 minutes, Joseph Greywolf eliminated 11 German soldiers. He did not use his rifle. He did not use grenades. He used only the knife his father had given him, the knife forged from a cavalry saber, the knife that carried the weight of generations of Apache warriors. When the rest of the unit moved in to secure the listening post, they found him standing in the center of the ruins, his face painted with ash and blood, his eyes reflecting the distant flash of artillery like the eyes of a wolf caught in firelight. Word of what had happened spread through the American lines with the speed of a brush fire. The officers tried to suppress the stories, worried about the effect on morale, but there was no stopping them. The soldiers whispered about the Indian who could walk through walls, who could kill without making a sound, who had brought the terror of the frontier to the trenches of France. The German soldiers heard those whispers too, or perhaps they simply observed the results of Joseph's work and drew their own conclusions. Either way, within weeks of his arrival at the front, the legend of Der Geist was born. Captain Whitfield began receiving requests from commanders all along the line. There was a German sniper terrorizing a sector near Verdun. Could the Ghost deal with him? There was an enemy observation post that had survived 3 artillery barrages. Could the Ghost eliminate it? There was a German colonel who was organizing a counteroffensive. Could the Ghost make him disappear? Joseph accepted every mission. He moved through no man's land as if it were the Arizona desert, as if the craters were canyons, and the trenches were arroyos, and the enemy soldiers were nothing more than prey to be stalked and killed. He worked alone mostly, preferring the solitude, but sometimes he took Thomas Birdsong with him. The 2 Native Americans communicating in a mixture of hand signals and whispered words that no one else could understand. The missions became more dangerous. The Germans, realizing that they were facing something beyond their experience, began setting traps. They posted double sentries. They strung tripwires connected to flares. They trained dogs to patrol the perimeter. None of it mattered. Joseph adapted to each new obstacle with the same calm efficiency that characterized everything he did. When the Germans used dogs, he learned to mask his scent with mud and rotting vegetation. When they used flares, he learned to freeze in place, becoming one more shadow among shadows. When they doubled their sentries, he simply killed them twice as fast. But the war was changing Joseph in ways that even he did not fully understand. The nightly raids, the constant killing, the endless parade of dead faces, it was all taking a toll. He began to have dreams of the Arizona desert, of the mountains where his father was buried, of the old life that had been stolen from him. He would wake in the darkness of his dugout, his heart pounding, his hands reaching for the knife that was never far from his side. In one dream that recurred again and again, he was a child again, sitting at his father's feet, listening to the old stories. His father was telling him about the Ga'an, the mountain spirits who protected the Apache people. The Ga'an were warriors, his father said. They fought against the forces of chaos and destruction. But they were also healers. They taught the people how to live in balance with the world, how to take only what they needed, how to give back more than they took. When Joseph woke from these dreams, he felt a profound sense of loss. He had become a warrior, yes. He had proven himself in battle, had earned the respect of his comrades and the fear of his enemies. But what was he fighting for? Not for his people, who remained imprisoned on the reservations. Not for his country, which had tried to destroy everything he loved. Not even for himself, because the person he had been before the war felt like a stranger now, someone he could barely remember. It was Thomas who finally confronted him about it. The two men were sitting in a shell crater one night, waiting for the signal to begin another raid, when Thomas said, "You are losing yourself, brother. I can see it in your eyes." Joseph did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know who I am anymore. In the desert, I was Apache. In the army, I was a soldier. But here, in this place, I am something else, something that has no name." Thomas nodded. "My grandfather warned me about this," he said. "He called it the Shadow Road. He said that warriors who walk too long in the darkness sometimes forget how to find their way back to the light." "Is there a way back?" Joseph asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather believed that there was. He said that the spirits never abandon us, even when we abandon ourselves. He said that if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear their voices, calling us home." The signal came before Joseph could respond. A single white flare arcing into the sky, painting the landscape in its ghostly light. The two men rose from their crater and began moving toward the German lines, two shadows among shadows, two warriors walking the razor's edge between life and death. That night, something happened that would haunt Joseph for the rest of his life. The mission was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance, just a quick look at the German positions in preparation for a larger offensive. But when Joseph and Thomas reached the enemy trenches, they found something they had not expected: a field hospital. Dozens of wounded German soldiers lying on stretchers, tended by nurses and orderlies who had no weapons, no defenses, nothing but bandages and morphine, and the desperate hope that they could save at least some of the men in their care. Joseph stopped at the edge of the trench, his knife in his hand, and looked down at the scene below. The wounded soldiers were crying out in German, words he could not understand but whose meaning was universal. They were calling for their mothers. They were begging for water. They were praying to a God who seemed to have abandoned this corner of the world. "We should go," Thomas whispered. "This is not our mission." But Joseph did not move. He stood there, frozen, staring at the wounded men who were his enemies, who had been trying to kill him for months, who would try to kill him again if they ever recovered. And he realized, with a clarity that cut through all the confusion and doubt that had been plaguing him, that they were just like him. They were warriors who had been sent to fight a war they did not start, for reasons they did not fully understand. They were sons and brothers and fathers who wanted nothing more than to go home. He sheathed his knife. He turned away from the trench, and he began walking back toward the American lines, with Thomas following close behind. Captain Whitfield was waiting for them when they returned. The captain's face was hard, his eyes cold. "You disobeyed orders," he said. The reconnaissance was not completed. Joseph met his gaze without flinching. "There was a hospital," he said. "Wounded men. I will not kill wounded men." Whitfield stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Good," he said. "I was beginning to wonder if there was anything left of the man beneath the warrior. Now I know there is." The captain pulled out a flask and offered it to Joseph. "The Indians called them the shadow walkers," he said. "The warriors who could move between the worlds of the living and the dead. My research suggested that they believed these warriors had a sacred duty, not just to kill, but to decide who deserved to die and who deserved to live. I wanted to know if you remembered that duty." Joseph took the flask but did not drink. He looked at the captain with new eyes. "You knew," he said. "You knew about the hospital." Whitfield nodded. "It was a test," he admitted. "Perhaps an unfair one. But I needed to know what kind of man I was sending into the darkness. Now I know that you are the kind of man who can find his way back to the light." That conversation marked a turning point for Joseph. He continued to go on missions, continued to kill when killing was necessary. But something had shifted inside him. He began to see the war not as a hunting ground where he could prove his worth, but as a tragedy that was consuming millions of lives on both sides. He began to understand that his skills, the skills his father had taught him, the skills that had been passed down through generations of Apache warriors, were not meant to serve the machinery of industrial slaughter. They were meant to protect, to defend, to preserve life, not to destroy it. And yet, the war went on. The artillery continued to thunder. The gas continued to drift across the trenches. The bodies continued to pile up in no man's land, rotting under the sun, sinking into the mud, becoming part of the landscape of death that stretched from horizon to horizon. In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched their final great offensive. They called it Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, and it was the largest military operation the world had ever seen. Over 1 million German soldiers attacked along a front of more than 50 miles, smashing through the Allied lines, advancing further in a few weeks than either side had moved in 3 years of fighting. The Special Operations Group was thrown into the chaos, assigned to slow the German advance by any means necessary. Joseph led mission after mission, striking at communication lines, eliminating officers, sowing confusion behind enemy lines. He slept no more than 2 or 3 hours a night. He ate when he could, drank when he could, killed when he had to, and still the Germans kept coming. It was during this desperate time that Joseph performed the feat that would make him a legend. The Germans had captured a strategic crossroads about 20 miles behind the Allied front, a junction that controlled the flow of supplies and reinforcements to the entire sector. If it remained in enemy hands, the Allied counteroffensive would be impossible. If it could be retaken, the tide might turn. A full division was assembling to assault the position, but the attack would not be ready for another 48 hours. In the meantime, someone needed to hold the Germans in place, to prevent them from reinforcing or fortifying their position. Someone needed to make them believe that they were facing a much larger force than they actually were. Captain Whitfield called Joseph into his dugout and explained the situation. "I need you to go to that crossroads," he said. "I need you to keep them busy for 2 days. I know what I am asking. I know it may be impossible, but you are the only one who might be able to do it." Joseph looked at the map, at the little X that marked the crossroads, at the lines and arrows that represented thousands of men and millions of bullets. Then he looked up at the captain and said, "I will need supplies, ammunition, explosives, and I will need to go alone." The captain started to argue, but Joseph cut him off. "If I take others, they will die," he said. "This is not a mission for soldiers. This is a hunt, and I am the only hunter who can survive it." He set out that night, carrying everything he could on his back, moving through the shattered landscape like a ghost. When he reached the outskirts of the crossroads, he spent 6 hours observing the German positions, memorizing their patterns, identifying their weaknesses. Then he began his work. For the next 47 hours, Joseph Greywolf waged a one-man war against an entire German regiment. He struck from the darkness, killing sentries, destroying ammunition dumps, cutting communication wires. He set booby traps that exploded without warning, creating panic among troops who could not see their attacker. He started fires that forced the Germans to divert men from their positions to fight the flames. He moved so quickly and struck from so many different directions that the German commander became convinced he was facing a battalion of American raiders. The Germans sent patrols to hunt him down. None of them returned. They set ambushes along every possible approach. Joseph walked through them as if they did not exist. They brought in dogs, and he killed the dogs. They brought in their best sharpshooters, and he killed the sharpshooters. They brought in reinforcements, and he killed them too. By the time the American division arrived to assault the crossroads, the German regiment was in disarray. Their commander had been shot through the head while standing in what he believed was a secure bunker. Their communications were in shambles. Their ammunition was running low, and their morale had been shattered by the relentless, invisible attacks that had plagued them for 2 days. The assault was a success. The crossroads was retaken with minimal casualties, and Joseph Greywolf, the Apache scout who had held an entire regiment at bay with nothing but his knife and his rifle and the skills his father had taught him, walked out of the battlefield as the sun rose over the devastated landscape. He had not slept in 50 hours. He had killed more men than he could count, and he felt nothing, no triumph, no relief, no pride, only a vast emptiness, a hollow space where something important used to be. Thomas found him sitting on a pile of rubble at the edge of the crossroads, staring at nothing. "Brother," Thomas said, kneeling beside him, "are you all right?" Joseph turned to look at him, and Thomas saw something in his eyes that he had never seen before. It was not madness. It was not despair. It was something worse. It was understanding. "I know now why my father died," Joseph said. "He died because he saw what I am seeing. He saw that there is no end to this, no victory that can wash away the blood, no peace that can bring back the dead. He saw that the world is broken, and that we are just fragments, cutting each other as we fall." Thomas did not know what to say. He sat beside his friend in the ruins of the crossroads, watching the smoke rise from the battlefield, listening to the distant thunder of artillery that never seemed to stop. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll.